So I just wanted to clarify the aims of these notes. So we're not going to avoid details. There's plenty of slides that go really deep into things and potentially cause confusion. The aim is also not to provide just enough information for the exam. So why create them at all? Well, hopefully anyone viewing them, I can provide them with more autonomy. So I want to show some of the sources that I've used that help with the exam. Just push the boundaries forward in the different areas. So you can now, the kind of things you might gain is, were you to take a topic further? Maybe you're not going to, but if you were to, what kind of resources should you look at? So if you wanted to know about gradient boosting, at least now you know that you could, if you wanted to, spend some time looking at one of Patrick Winston's MIT lectures on that, but that would probably involve some maths and getting familiar with some maths. So you can now know exactly how deeply out of my depth I am. So the notes are trying to link everything into further resources, and they're supposed to be referenced, so you could know that if you wanted to go further, where would you go to? So there's a lot of signposts just saying, I can't speak about this, but this person can. And that's why also occasionally I will be not just signposting you to other people, but spoon feeding things, because reading through the text line by line, in a way, these notes are just a record of me learning. So, okay. So here are some people who will be helpful with some of the content on the AI exam, or with AI in general. And I'm going to go through 7. First of all, Patrick Winston and Stuart Russell, experts on AI. Arthur Holmes, he was a philosophy lecturer, and that's just in case you want to look at any philosophical topics. Tom Mitchell specialises in machine learning. Paul Daugherty, Max Tegmark, and David Chalmers, finally, number 7. David Chalmers basically focused on consciousness. Can machines be conscious? He's a philosopher. So first of all, Patrick Winston. He was born in 1943 and then actually recently died in 2019. And he was based at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, MIT, in the US state called Massachusetts, and he gave a course called 6.034, and it was on artificial intelligence. And all the lectures are on YouTube. It's an engineering course, so occasionally they involve mathematics, and you won't be able to understand any of it, but you can just increase your understanding a little bit, perhaps. So he was a professor at MIT. You can see MIT is within Massachusetts, so above the US state of New York. There's the White House. You can see there on this map they've pointed out Chicago, which is within this state called Illinois. But anyway, yeah, so right on the east coast of USA at MIT. There it is, next to the Charles River. It's called the Charles River, and Harvard Square you can see on the map here. So Harvard down to MIT. At MIT, Winston taught 6.034 artificial intelligence and 6.803, 6.833 human intelligence enterprise. Winston's How to Speak talk was an MIT tradition for over 40 years. Offered every January, the talk is intended to improve your speaking ability in critical situations by teaching you a few heuristic rules. A book with his insights and teachings on communication was published in 2020 by the MIT Press.
So let's start up here a definition of artificial intelligence by saying that it's about thinking, whatever that is. But my definition of artificial intelligence has to be rather broad. So we're going to say it's not only about thinking, it's also about perception, and it's about action. And if this were a philosophy class, then I'd stop right there and just say, in this subject, we're going to talk about problems involving thinking, perception, and action. But this is not a philosophy class. This is a Course 6 class. It's an engineering school class. It's an MIT class. So we need more than that. And therefore, we're going to talk about models that are targeted at thinking, perception, and action. And this should not be strange to you, because model making is what MIT is about. If you run into someone at a bar or a relative asks you what you do at MIT, the right knee-jerk reaction is to say, we learn how to build models. That's what we do at MIT. We build models using differential equations. We build models using probabilities. We build models using physical and computational simulations. But whatever we do, we build models. Even in humanities class.
The second person, Stuart Russell, he's a British computer scientist. He grew up in Portsmouth in the south of the UK. Then went to the University of Oxford to study physics and became a professor at the University of California in Berkeley. And this is where he's currently based. And Mr. Russell, with someone called Peter Norvig, has written a very influential textbook on artificial intelligence called Artificial Intelligence: A Modern Approach. And they've continued to bring out, or the publishers have continued to bring out, new editions on this influential book, which is used by many, many universities. So here's the second edition in green, and the third edition looks like this, with a picture of a robot hand moving a chess piece. He does a lot of work with helping to engage the public, so he has a few lectures that are accessible. Here is a TED talk he gave.
I'm trying to redefine AI to get away from this classical notion of machines that intelligently pursue objectives. There are three principles involved. The first one is a principle of altruism, if you like, that the robot's only objective is to maximize the realization of human objectives, of human values. And by values here, I don't mean touchy-feely, goody-goody values. I just mean whatever it is that the human would prefer their life to be like. And so this actually violates Asimov's law that the robot has to protect its own existence. It has no interest in preserving its existence whatsoever. The second law is a law of humility, if you like. And this turns out to be really important to make robots safe. It says that the robot does not know what those human values are. So it has to maximize them, but it doesn't know what they are. And that avoids this problem of single-minded pursuit of an objective. This uncertainty turns out to be crucial. Now, in order to be useful to us, it has to have some idea of what we want. It obtains that information primarily by observation of human choices. So our own choices reveal information about what it is that we prefer our life to be like. So those are the three principles. Let's see how that applies to this question of can you switch the machine off, as Turing suggested. So here's a PR2 robot. This is one that we have in our lab. And it has a big red off switch right on the back. And the question is it going to let you switch it off? So if we do it the classical way, we give it the objective of fetch the coffee. I must fetch the coffee. I can't fetch the coffee if I'm dead, so obviously the PR2 has been listening to my talk. And so it says, okay, therefore, I must disable my off switch. And probably taser all the other people in Starbucks who might interfere with me. So this seems to be inevitable, right? This kind of failure mode seems to be inevitable, and it follows from having a concrete, definite objective. So what happens if the machine is uncertain about the objective? Well, it reasons in a different way. It says, okay, the human might switch me off, but only if I'm doing something wrong. Well, I don't really know what wrong is, but I know that I don't want to do it. So that's the first and second principles right there. So I should let the human switch me off. And if
So Stuart Russell there is trying to see how we can avoid problems with robots becoming destructive and trying to kill other humans to achieve their goal or end. Because one of the problems with machines is that we give them goals, but we don't know what's good for us. This is like the King Midas problem. In the myth of King Midas, he said, "I want everything I touch to turn to gold." But did he really want that? Because then his family turned to gold. They turn to metal and die, essentially. All his food turns to gold and he dies. And that's a bit like what happens with machines. So he's come up with his 3 principles. First principle, they should maximise human values. Second principle, a principle of humanity. And the third principle, that it should learn about the values from human behaviour. And Stuart Russell gave the Reef Lectures, this prestigious series of lectures, in 2021. And they're all available on the BBC Radio 4 website. So you can go online and listen to them now. And these, again, are aimed to advance the public understanding. So they're quite entertaining, actually, and interesting. The Reef Lectures are just named after someone called Lord Reef, who said the BBC should keep providing accessible and informative education to the public. So there were 4 lectures he gave. The first was called The Biggest Event in Human History. The second lecture is AI in Warfare. The third lecture is AI in the Economy, and it's about will we still have jobs, humans. And lecture 4 was A Future for Humans. The third person is Arthur F. Holmes. He was a lecturer in philosophy at Wheaton College, which was in Illinois. He was born in 1924 and died in 2011. And his lectures are available on YouTube on Plato, Aristotle, etc. For example, in his first Reef lecture, Stuart Russell mentions Aristotle. He quotes a line from one of Aristotle's works called the Nicomachean Ethics, which says that men don't reason about ends, they reason about means. Or perhaps it's the other way around. It's quite important. So Aristotle grounds some of the thinking in AI. So if you did want to go further with that, I mean, there are lots of resources on philosophy, but
what our physical senses, what they apprehend is the form of a particular thing without its material. Now, that's not very strange when you figure that the matter couldn't possibly get in your eye. The matter of this marker couldn't possibly get in your ear, you see. The matter remains intact. But what the senses apprehend is the form, shape, smell, colour, without the material that has the shape, smell, colour. Okay? Now, what we have then is a vast barrage of sensations of that sort, coming through the 5 senses. In addition to the 5 senses, he takes...
So for Aristotle, there's this distinction that runs throughout his work between matter and form, and this is everything he explains. He uses this distinction between matter and form. And because everything's so integrated in Aristotle, that will relate some way to his doctrine that nature is teleological. He thinks everything in nature heads towards the telos, or end. Things in nature have a purpose. And what is it to be a thing in nature? Well, it's to have a certain form and certain matter. And this combination of form and matter is hylomorphism. But the fourth person is Tom Mitchell. He specializes in machine learning, which is a subset of AI. He wrote an influential textbook called Machine Learning. And the BCS exam uses his definition of machine learning. It's just a helpful way of thinking about what a machine learning problem is. Who is Tom Mitchell? Born in 1951. He actually received his first degree from MIT, where Patrick Winston was a professor. So in 1973 he got a degree in electrical engineering. He actually grew up in the US state of New York. But in 1986 he went to the universities he's based at now, CMU, which is in Pennsylvania. So there's his textbook, Machine Learning, and here you can see Pennsylvania, which is to the left of the state of New York. There's Massachusetts. So CMU, Carnegie Mellon University, is here within Pennsylvania. So let's look at him defining machine learning.
So machine learning is a subject close to my own heart. It's about the question of how do we build computer programs that automatically improve what they're doing through some kind of experience. So to have a well-defined problem in machine learning, I'd say we need to have three things specified. We need to have some performance task that the computer is performing, and some metric for what it means to do that better or worse, and then some kind of experience from which the program can train. So for example, you're very familiar with spam filters, and you're probably aware that spam filters are trained using machine learning. So if we took that as an example, we'd say the task is to take an arbitrary email as input and produce a label spam or not. That's the task. The performance metric we would like to optimize, I could make up.
So to clarify, we've got PTE. Whenever we've got a machine learning problem, you can talk about what is the performance, because you can't just say it'll improve automatically with experience. The program, you need to say what improvement is. So that's why you need a performance. Some say what performance is. What is performance? There has to be some task, which we'll denote with a capital letter T, and also what is going to be the experience. What does it learn from specifically? And so he's just cashing out an example of a spam filter on an email inbox to help us understand this idea of P, T, and E.
Several random spam filter programs, but there's some performance metric that, for example, you know what your own spam filter, your own notion of spam is. And so there's some, if you were, for example, to label a set of emails as ones that you consider to be spam or not, then we could say our performance metric we might use to make a well-defined learning problem is to match as closely as possible the labels that you've assigned to the emails.
You see, this is kind of strange, because with something like a machine vacuum cleaner, the performance metric might be the amount of the weight of dirt cleaned up. So if there are greater number of grams of dirt in the vacuum cleaner, then it is then it has improved, then it is doing better. Although it's a bit more complicated than that. But so what would the performance metric be with a spam filter? It's not because you kind of think how do you get better at detecting spam? Either you do detect it or you don't detect it. Well, the way he's kind of put it, Tom Mitchell, is that it's to improve at this task is to kind of become more accurate with it, to be more accurate in what the spam filter declares to be spam. So he's talked already about labeling data. So at some point you're going to have to tell the program, the fact is this is spam, this is not spam, because otherwise the program won't know. And so the performance metric is how much of a match there is between what the program guesses to be spam and what is actually spam, according to things you've in the past that have said are spam.
That is for the program to learn to match as closely as possible your own labels. So that would be a performance metric. And the type of experience, well, it could be just what we said. It could be the experience the program's going to learn from is a set of labeled emails. This one's spam, this one's not spam, here's another spam. And so there's an example of a well-defined machine learning problem. We can make another one also with spam. We could say, for example, we could change the performance metric.
Okay.
Maybe you don't really want to minimize the number of errors the spam filter makes compared to your gold standard. Maybe you actually are more worried about losing a good email into your spam folder than you are about accidentally looking at what is actually spam. So you might actually have a slightly different performance metric that you'd like to optimize that gives a bigger penalty if the program accidentally labels non-spam as spam than if it does it the other way around. So that would give you a different, again, well-defined problem. We also could change the experience. So for example, so far we're talking about training a spam filter by giving examples of emails with labels, spam not. Some computer programs, and we'll learn about them this semester, can also take unlabeled examples, unlabeled emails, as additional data. And there are algorithms that can perform better, learning algorithms that can learn better if they're given both those labeled examples and a whole bunch of unlabeled email, which seems kind of like magic. But by the end of the semester, you'll understand.
So we've got there the introduction of the distinction between labeled data and unlabeled data, which I think is related to the distinction between supervised learning and unsupervised learning. And he's right. How can that make sense? How can it actually do better at getting to know what's spam and what's not spam by having unlabeled? How can it possibly be better that the examples are unlabeled?
And what's the principle underlying that? And in fact, what kinds of situations, what kind of formal structure a problem could have that makes unlabeled data be actually useful for training a spam filter. And spam actually is an example of a problem that has the structure that makes unlabeled data useful. Okay, so there's roughly speaking what we mean by machine learning. We could make up a lot of examples of machine learning problems and characterize them this way.
The fifth person is Paul Daugherty. He worked at Accenture, which is a professional services company. They're a big company. They specialize in technology and IT. So he's the technology officer at Accenture. He's the group chief executive, which is not the CEO of the company, but he's an author of a book, co-author with H. James Wilson. And this book is called Human Plus Machine. And this is it's not a mathematical or technical book, but this is looking at some possibilities for how the workplace will change in the future. So this is kind of from a manager's or consultant's perspective. In this video, he introduces this threefold distinction. He says you have to reimagine how you solve problems in the workplace. Secondly, you have to, he talks about the missing middle. I want to see how he explains that, because I always forget what that is. And thirdly, he says you need to think about ethical problems.
What industries are you seeing artificial intelligence being applied in? And how is it working across?
Now, his answer here is essentially all of them. However, later on, he does helpfully, for the purposes of our exam, give us a specific example where AI is used, a very concrete example in the jet engines of planes.
Industries.
You know, the industry question's a really interesting one with AI, because I could look at every other technology. I've been with Accenture 32 years, as I said, and I've seen all these other waves come through, from desktop computing to client-server, cloud, mobile, IoT. And you could always identify an industry that was, or two that were the early leaders with it. What's different with AI is it's so broad-based, because AI really is a way to change the way business works. And we're seeing adoption in everything from utilities and oil and gas and chemicals, to insurance and banking, to retail and consumer goods, to automotive and industrial, across the board, including in the public sector with government services. So it's remarkably broad-based is what I'd say. And what we're seeing in the work we do and we talk about in the book is three things that we think are key to really adopting AI successfully, regardless of what industry you're in. The first is taking this view of reimagining the way you think about your industry. If you're trying to just apply the same approach, or re-engineer, which is the buzzword we used in the past, the approach we used in the past, or automate, we don't think you're going to be successful. You need to think differently about how you're solving a business problem, and that's reimagining. And the second thing you need to do is thinking about the jobs and the work you do differently, which we call the missing middle, of the new categories of jobs that are created. And the third thing you need to do is think about responsible AI, because AI introduces new considerations and questions about your consumers, your workers, and how you're doing business, the communities you operate in. And you need to think differently about how you apply the technology, and things like ethics and bias and many other issues as you think about AI.
Can you give us an example or a case study that you found where an organization or an industry actually was able to apply this sort of model that you lay out?
Okay, so just to be clear, what the problem he is interested in is, Paul Daugherty, is what makes the difference between a company or even an industry that successfully adopts AI and one that doesn't successfully adopt AI. You might think, how could you unsuccessfully adopt AI? Hopefully he provides detail on that in his book, and how do you unsuccessfully that? And that's what those three things are about. Ensuring you're thinking correctly if you want to implement AI in your
successfully.
company.
Yeah, you know, I think there's a number of examples. I think a great example, say, is in the industrial equipment arena. If you look at what's happening there in the company like, say, a GE that we talk about in the book, General Electric, and the work that they've done in their manufacturing and operations with AI-enabled digital twin technologies. If you think about, let's say it's maintaining a jet aircraft engine that's manufactured by GE. In the past, the technician would have a checklist. You'd go check the engine when the plane stopped and do some maintenance and work through a process. And you're typically checking things that weren't broken. It was somewhat tedious to go through and do the same thing every time. And so for the worker, it wasn't using all their capability, and for the company, it wasn't the most effective process. Contrast that with a digital twin, AI-enabled model. We have real-time information from the engine. How's it really operating as it's flying through the air or on the ground, wherever it might be? What might fail when? You can run simulations using AI to understand when I might need to maintain it. And the technician on the ground now can be in control of these variables and these simulations, and make decisions like, using a revenue model, should I take the plane out of service now to maintain the engine, or will it be more effective to do that at the next stop? And is it safe enough to go to the next stop? So you're decentralizing decision making, increasing the effectiveness of that person on the front lines and their productivity, and increasing the outcomes for the company. And that's an example of all those, the reimagining, different way of working, come together with a new type of role, and applying the technology in the right way that we see in industry after industry.
So, good answer. So at the end, he was just giving that sentence to show how that fulfills each of those three rules which he set out. When General Electric put in these engines on the plane, and yes, it meant that humans were doing certain things, were not doing certain things anymore, but there are also new things they're doing. That's the missing middle. They reimagined how they did it, and then the third thing, they presumably did it responsibly as well. So notice how he said that, and before, the engineers would have to literally check every part to make sure it wasn't working. So they'd be doing this kind of manual, there'd be fact-finding, whereas now they can just go in, fix it, which is presumably still something that only humans can do. First, the sixth person is Max Tegmark, born in 1967. He is currently a professor at MIT, the place Patrick Winston was based. He is the president of something called the Future of Life Institute. And this institute organised the Asilomar conference, which occurred in California, which we'll look at later. They got loads of people to meet to discuss how we should think about AI in the future. Can we avoid catastrophes? He was born in Sweden. Max Tegmark. He brought out a book in 2017 called Life 3.0, and it was reviewed in all the major publications. It was on bestseller lists. Barack Obama put it in his best of 2018 books list. And it considers a few possibilities for the far future or near future in which humans are living with AI. Oh look, someone called Stuart Russell gave a review of the book in Nature, which you can go and read. In the interests of disclosure, Tegmark and I, this is Stuart Russell speaking, we are collaborators and share a literary agent. With physicists Stephen Hawking and Frank Wilczek, we wrote the 2014 Huffington Post article, and this was an article that set out warning alarms, ostensibly a review of Wally Feister's dystopian AI film Transcendence. This article was really a call to the AI community to take the risks of intelligent systems seriously. Thus, I am unlikely to disagree strongly with the premise of Tegmark's book. Tegmark argues, may or may not spread through the universe and flourish for billions of years because of decisions we make now, a possibility both seductive and overwhelming. The book's title refers to a third phase in evolutionary history. For almost 4 billion years, both hardware and software, so the idea is that our bodies are hardware, and software, which is the capacity for generating behaviour which isn't physical, they were fixed by biology. For the next 100,000 years, learning and culture enabled humans to adapt and control their own software. And then in the imminent so I think we're in the second phase now. And in the imminent third phase, both software and hardware can be redesigned. This may sound like transhumanism, the movement to re-engineer body and brain. But Tegmark's focus is on AI, which supplements mental capabilities with external devices. And he says this book is a bit like someone else's called Nick Bostrom, this philosopher based at the University of Oxford, who's looking at issues of existential risk concerning humanity. Unlike Bostrom, however, Tegmark is not trying to prove that risk is unavoidable, and he eschews that he doesn't get involved in dense philosophy in favour of asking the reader which scenarios they think are more probable or desirable. And Stuart Russell says, I strongly recommend both books. I suspect that Tegmark's is less likely to provoke in AI researchers a common allergic reaction and make them retreat into defensive arguments, having to protect their AI and say it's actually really friendly. And he just finishes by saying, we don't worry about remote but species-ending possibilities such as black holes. So why worry about superintelligent AI? He's saying actually this is the kind of thing that a lot of AI researchers say. Don't worry about AI. Well, here's an answer as to why we should. Well, if physicists were working to make such black holes, wouldn't we ask them if it was safe? So yeah.
It's not like that this is anything new to engineers. I think it's just that we're so used to the idea that AI didn't work, that we didn't need to worry about the impact of things. And now it is beginning to have an impact, so we should think it through. And then there are also a few challenges which are really unique and specific to AI. Some of the Asilomar principles talk about them, and this research agenda for AI safety research is a really long list of specific sort of safety engineering challenges that we need smart people like you to work on. And I hope we can support that.
So also on the topic of security engineering, a lot of rockets blew up on the way to the moon.
Yeah.
And given the intelligence
that evolution came up with, my guess is that the fastest route to human level eye will actually use a combination of deep neural networks with GoFi, various good old-fashioned AI techniques, more logic-based things, which have a lot of their own strength for building a world model and things like this.
Live question.
And maybe I should just add one.
Sorry, I was trying to get to his summary, but
It's better for them all if nobody patents the way to make it safe.
I'm still in his Q&A.
The next massive asteroid strike, like the one that took the dinos out, or the next super volcano, or another one on a list of long things that we know are going to happen to Earth, that technology can create. That technology can prevent, but technology that we don't have yet. That's going to require further development of our tech. So I, for one, think that it would be really foolish if we just run away from technology. I would feel I'm much more excited about it in the Google spirit. And I love your old slogan, "Don't be evil." Asking, what can we do to steer the development of our technology in a direction so that life can really flourish, not just for the next election cycle, but for a very, very long time on Earth and maybe even throughout our cosmos. Thank you.
There we go. So he's got some concerns. Now the next person, number 7, he's a philosopher called David Chalmers, and a great way to get into his work is he gave a TED talk in 2014. It's entitled "How Do We Explain Consciousness?" Now, David Chalmers is basically a computer scientist, as well as he's got a scientific and mathematical background. So he's actually concerned to try and look at consciousness vigorously, to try and integrate it into other areas of scientific study. The key point is he thinks consciousness really is a phenomenon that we have to explain, the same way we have to explain that scientists explain hurricanes and diseases. He thinks it's there to be explained, and because not everyone does think that, we're going to look at Daniel Dennett in a moment.
On the other hand, we don't know how to accommodate it into our scientific view of the world.
Consciousness.
So I think consciousness right now is a kind of anomaly, one that we need to integrate into our view of the world, but we don't yet see how. Faced with an anomaly like this, radical ideas may be needed.
He's going to propose 2.
That we may need 1 or 2 ideas that initially seem crazy before we can come to grips with consciousness scientifically. Now, there are a few candidates for what those crazy ideas might be. My friend Dan Dennett, who's here today, has one. His crazy idea is that there is no hard problem of consciousness. The whole idea of the inner subjective movie involves a kind of illusion or a confusion. Actually, all we've got to do is explain the objective functions, the behaviors of the brain, and then we've explained everything that needs to be explained. Well, I say, more power to him. That's the kind of radical idea that we need to explore if you want to have a purely reductionist, brain-based theory of consciousness. At the same time, for me and for many other people, that view is a bit too close to simply denying the datum of consciousness to be satisfactory. So I go in a different direction. In the time remaining, I want to explore 2 crazy ideas that I think may have some promise. The first crazy idea is that consciousness is fundamental. Physicists sometimes take some aspects of the universe as fundamental building blocks: space and time and mass. They postulate fundamental laws governing them, like the laws of gravity or quantum mechanics. These fundamental properties and laws aren't explained in terms of anything more basic. Rather, they're taken as primitive, and you build up the world from there. Now, sometimes the list of fundamentals expands. In the 19th century.
So that's the first crazy idea, that consciousness is fundamental. And don't think that that's so crazy. I mean, all he just means it in a kind of deflationary sense. And it is a very logically, that it is one of the only possibilities that we have. Remember, the problem is we can't explain consciousness in terms of other things. So clearly it's going to look like a very tempting option to say consciousness is fundamental. Consciousness is the explainer. Now, the second crazy idea is that consciousness is universal, as he puts it. And this is sometimes associated with panpsychism, the idea pan, everywhere, consciousness, psych, panpsychism. And at the end of his talk he says, so this panpsychist vision, the second idea, is a radical one. I don't know that it's correct. I'm more confident about the first crazy idea, that consciousness is fundamental. This view raises any number of questions, though. How do those little bits of consciousness add up? Because he's kind of saying that consciousness is innate in all the little neurons that add up to make the brain. If it's fundamental, it's kind of, in some sense, already there. And if we can answer those questions, though, then I think we're going to be well on the way to a theory of consciousness. Very good. And then another TED Talk is given by Daniel Dennett. However, this isn't very helpful, this TED Talk, for understanding what Dan Dennett thinks about consciousness. He doesn't really talk about explicitly say what he thinks about consciousness. All he's doing in this 2007, that should say, talk, is saying that we should be humble about what we know about our own minds. It's not true that we have this first personal knowledge that's much better than objective knowledge about the mind. You can get him explaining himself more explicitly in this New Scientist video, where he's questioned for about 40 minutes. Remember, for Dennett, we don't have to explain consciousness. We explain it away. Like, imagine you walk into a room and you think everyone's against you. You don't have to come up with some theory as to why. You just explain it away. Oh, so-and-so's not angry with you. They just think this. They just think... There's this distinction between explaining something and explaining it away. It merely appeared like it was there.
Beings regularly understand it. But some organisms don't just have the benefit of having these special purpose trackers. So it's like somebody trying to explain how a smartphone works by just looking at the screen and pressing it and having no idea about how that relates to what's going on under the hood, inside the phone. There's layers and layers and layers of activity going on there, and you'd never ever figure it out by just playing around with the user interface. Well, what consciousness is basically the brain's user interface for itself. It's the level of simplification that is most useful in the control of a human body. And in fact,
so it serves a purpose.
I've recently been
helps us
putting
survive.
it even more strongly and saying, actually, my consciousness is the way it is because it's your user interface to my mind. If you want to know about my mind, ask me. I can talk to you about it. I can describe in irresistibly metaphorical terms. I can't describe it in
For example, there, he gave an analogy between consciousness and a mobile phone. The user interface of the mobile phone, think about what that is. You don't have to know about bits and bytes to help you use your mobile. It's all simplified. And that's what consciousness is like. It's a user interface.
Other terms. What's going on?
And here he's saying, well, why would I need to have this eagle-eye view of what's going in my brain or some user interface? from the first personal subjective, because then I can present it to other people, so I can communicate what's going on in my head to others.
In my head, and it's a very useful level of description. It's the personal level. I can tell you what I'm thinking about, what sensations I'm having, what reminds me of what. But all of that is a fractional edited summary of everything that's going on in my brain that's permitting me to say those things to you. In the same way that what you see on the screen and hear in the sound effects on your smartphone is just a very carefully edited and distorted account of what's going on inside the box. So
some people hear, when they hear Daniel Dennett say consciousness is an illusion, they freak out and think it's some wacky idea. But no, it's just in the manner that, imagine a scientist or your friend who studies geography at university says rainbows, they're actually just light refracting through the droplets in the atmosphere. And in that sense, rainbows don't exist. Rainbows are an illusion. So it's in that, and you don't go, oh no, that's insane. And it's in that manner that Dennett is saying consciousness is an illusion. He's just saying we can explain it away the same way we might explain away a rainbow. It's nothing. It's no insane idea, and he's saying, but he is also saying that consciousness has its certain uses. It's a bit like a user interface. I can communicate to other people. I can think about what I'm thinking.
Of being able to represent the activity of the trackers themselves, not of the things in the world, so that you can not just notice things, but notice that you're noticing them.
There we go. You can not just notice, but notice that you're noticing. So those are just 7 helpers who will help you to dive deeper in some of the areas on the AI exam.